if you didn't get it at the front of the class, there's a study sheet that is for next Monday's exam. It is also for those of you on Zoom. The study sheet is available on the Carmen site on the exam for units 1 and 2. What is it? It's the item there on the main page. So if you just look for that, you'll find it. So you can download it there as well. You'll see there's a whole lot of identifications. You want to know all of those. You're going to have 5 of them you need to identify well and completely, okay? Knowing all of them will prepare you for those second set of questions. Like all of these are related to each other. The second set of questions are slightly more interpretive, but they require a short, brief, succinct answer, like 3 to 5 sentences. And you want to know those. They will be, did I say 3 on the sheet? 3 of those on the exam, and then one final question. That final question is half the exam, and it's going to be interpreted. So you've got everything you need to be successful with this. It's going to require knowing how to answer those questions and not just looking at them and going, I think I know what the answer is, but actually making some effort to outline a little bit, because you'll see if you start to do that, that they're interrelated, and kind of starting from the basis of these identifications, you can build your way into some pretty good answers. Because history is based on those facts and then the interpretations of them. And it's the same structure of the exams. Questions about that? Next week in class, everybody who can should come into class. Please let Ives and I know specifically whether you're going to be taking it in class or on Zoom. The Zoom option is available, but you have to have a camera. We have to be able to see you the entire time you're taking the exam. You have to be sitting there in front of your computer taking this. And I think there's something else that we can do with this. I haven't done these quite yet. And there'll be a random set of questions. So everybody won't get the same exam necessarily on Zoom, but it will be essentially the same exam for anybody who's sitting in here. Any questions about any of that? No, I'm just going to look to see, do I have a chat box somewhere? Anybody, no questions online either about the exam? Okay, let's take a minute to think though, because we've been through 6 lectures already. We got 2 more. There's a lot of material. I moved very quickly through a lot of material, and you're expected to know the material. We've covered details from like 1840s all the way up through 1929 for the most part, although really today we're going to stop in the early 20s. And the large interpretive idea was this is about launching the modern and advancing the modern, okay? Major themes. And so the beginning of something new and then the refinement of that something new as the big interpretive theme. So first, before I get into the lecture, general questions. And I want to pause and stop and not jump into lecturing. I want you to stop and think for a minute. Okay, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes or so. I'm going to set a timer so I stop. I'd like to have some general questions. I'd like you to think about the course. Think about, and this is for you online as well, you can use the chat box. Look through your notes. Think about what you've been thinking when you've been sitting in here, right? Because you've been thinking, I know you have, and I've only been talking. Think about the things that we've covered and anything that you've wondered about that. Okay, I want you to just think a minute. So take a little time. Hey Siri, set my timer for 2 minutes.
Okay, your timer is set for 2 minutes.
See something. Focus and think, just think a little bit, like, what is this course leading you to wonder or think? What is it that you're not sure you get? What might be confusing? I'm not sure if if I can see the chat box online, so if the question's online, but really anything at all. I think one about there's no wrong question. I know you thought about some stuff in here. Yes, ma'am.
So on the study guide compared to like the notes, it says, in what ways did railroad development shape U.S. history after the Civil War? Would that just be like developing like more in the South?
Well, what did it do? Where did railroads get developed after the Civil War? Where was the intensive, and it came out of the Civil War in terms of a set of federal laws.
Pacific Railroad Act?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so where were those going?
Across the nation.
And so how are those different than the railroads of the 1850s? And it's part of the mark of the modern.
So it wasn't like exactly expanded yet, or like it wasn't as like coast to coast as they would like it to be.
Okay, it wasn't as developed. It didn't end up being as thickly developed. But it's also, and this is important, it's a national vision of railroads. It's not a regional vision of railroads. And so the shift to the modernized economy that's very much now a nationally oriented economy with the federal government pushing the nation. Those early railroads were mostly supported by states rather than the federal government. So there's this kind of shift upward in that. So that kind of development, what boomed with those railroads? What grew as a result of it?
Industrialization.
Which means what? It's a general term. Can you think about something specific that actually had an upward trajectory of output?
Like management, like a hierarchy, so like structure of like businesses.
Okay. And why were they structured that way? What did that help them do?
It like made things look more efficient, like there was better coordination, and not one person was controlling a bunch of workers.
Yeah. So we've talked now two influences of the railroad. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for, right? It's got these economic impacts. It's got this imaginary impacts, how we think about ourselves. It's got impacts on the changing institutions. It's got impacts on production output too. You could look at those upward trajectories of minerals in particular, which launched the second industrial revolution. Other questions? And I don't think I can see the chat box if there's anything online. But any questions online? Are we seeing anything there?
No, none that I can see.
No. Nothing else? Yes, sir.
Would one of those like answers like work with the railroads, kind of like for transportation, or like I don't want to say like tourism, but sort of like a transportation like to get to wherever place you want to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And you see, it does, tourism is the right word. Like that's a thing that emerges as a commodity. It's something people buy the stuff for and go and do as you know, you could think of visits to nature and visits to amusement parks and visits to the movies as essentially the same kind of experiential events, right? It's a commodity you're paying for somewhere else. And so tourism definitely comes up in that. And railroads launch it, but the car becomes like the magic way in. Anything else? Anything else at all? Oh, I'm sorry. All right, let me get started in today's lecture. As usual, lots of material to cover. This is called the Jim Crow era. We're talking about really from about 1877. I say to 1929 here, but I realize that I really stopped this in the mid-20s because we're going to go back and look at the late 20s again in the next unit. We're going to look at the social structures that emerged from the second industrial revolution. What came out of this mass production revolution, advancing from the first, and how some policies and racial attitudes ultimately shaped the texture of what the society looked like. This was the moment, the early 20th century was the moment when America was more than ever the land of opportunity. It was a land of opportunity, opportunity like the world had never seen in the United States. But the question we want to ask as we look at this and know this is who had access to that opportunity and who didn't and why? So let's just remember, we're second to last. Social lecture. Now you'll just note time-wise, it dips back a little bit earlier than the others, back to 1877. Why does the social lecture dip back to 1877? What's significant?
Slavery, like race issues.
Yeah, what 1877? Can we think of an episode in 1877? You folks online too? I'm not sure if I can see this. 1877. All right, we don't want to forget the abandonment of the South, the Compromise of 1877. I'll mention it again in a minute. 1877, the Reconstruction was over. It was over by federal legislation. The Union soldiers left. The Republican idea of extending a biracial democracy ended. And I'm going to argue that the abandonment of the freedom, in today's lecture, I'm going to argue abandoning them in the 1877 was probably the single most consequential national policy if you want to understand the social justice issues of the 20th century and the 21st century. All right, the abandonment of freed people in 1877, single most significant decision. All right, let's notice Second Industrial Revolution and mass production meant, and you see it there, jobs. Okay, it was a more efficient organization of goods and materials and the supply chain, but it meant more jobs, lots and lots and lots of jobs. But what kind of jobs? What kind of jobs are people doing more and more in this economy? Assembly line. And what does it require to get an assembly line job? You got 2 arms, 2 legs, eyes, and a set of motor skills, right? This is basic entry-level work. You don't need more than a few days training at most to be efficient at the part of the job that you master. You don't even need to know English to do it, right? You have 2 arms, 2 legs, a set of eyes at work, and some generally decent motor skills, and there are opportunities everywhere for you. Now, it's repetitive work. It's often difficult work. It's unskilled labor. You're using your body. You're not using your mind. But the Second Industrial Revolution advanced the labor demand even more than that first fossil fuel advancement in the 19th century. It increased the amount of work needed from people. It just simplified the work, right? So it made more access for people. It increased the amount of what we call wage labor as opposed to slave labor, right? And it increased the amount of unskilled entry-level work that was there that paid you, that gave you a wage. And it created opportunity. You know it created opportunity, right? So opportunity in a brand new way. We think about, I want to talk about slavery just for a minute. We think about United States slavery because we're United States citizens and it's part of our history as really something exceptional and difficult and painful in our history. But slavery itself is not exceptional. It wasn't, it became something that the modern world no longer stomached. But human unfree labor was a part of civilization going all the way back. Right, all the way back, the earliest stories in the Bible. Before that, the Sumerian civilizations, and all the way up to the present, right? We were the last civilization that engaged in it. What is unique about this industrial growth, this industrialization, and this mass production is it represented there at the end of the 19th century, the first time in human history, there was a large-scale expanding economic system not dependent on human slavery to grow. And in fact, that grows wealth to those who come in at the bottom, right? The new mass production, it's the demand for this bottom layer started in the mid-century, accelerated in the 1880s and grew exponentially coming into the 20th century. That's what we mean by opportunity. right? People who come into these jobs are coming from being serfs in Europe, right? They don't have any skills. They can move in and they can earn money. But the question still was, who's going to get to take advantage of this system? Who gets access to this opportunity? So let's kind of remember this crude structure. This is the Marxian structure. It's helpful. So we've got the people who own factories, roughly speaking, the people who manage factories, roughly speaking, and the people who do the work of the labor in the factories. The first wave in the 1880s pulled a whole new wave of immigration from both Europe and China, right? Filled the bottom tiers. Earlier, 1840s, 1850s, 1880s, a whole new generation of European immigrants entered. And so by the end of the century, there's a new middle class. This new first laborers come in 1840s, 1850s. Some of them move up into this space. And they're giving birth to a whole new generation of financial giants. More wealth. You remember that chart of per capita income. It's a steady increase of wealth. But let's look at the sources of labor. Let's look at it kind of granularly, because there were some very specific decisions that were made that structured what this was going to look like. And I'll give you the cliff notes, and then I'll walk through the details a little bit. First of all, freedmen were left out. Freed slaves were left out, intentionally kept out of the system. Second, Chinese labor, Asians specifically, were left out and excluded specifically. So first, let's start with the freedmen. And we remember, we go all the way back to the 1870s, late 1860s. Remember what happened to Black labor in the South that should have, rightfully speaking, benefited from this national economic growth. First, Southern whites organized terrorist organizations to oppose a biracial democracy. The federal government tried several efforts to get this terrorism under control, quite unsuccessfully. It had gained the upper hand by the time of the election in 1876. That contested election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. This was the first razor-thin margin contested election in U.S. history, as close as the 1960 election and the 2000 election. Tilden, right, who's a Democrat, you can see he made inroads up into the north, Connecticut, New York, Indiana, right? And Tilden won the popular vote by 250,000, which was 1.5% greater than Hayes. The red Hayes states in the South were all disputed. The Southern Democrats said, no, you cheated in those elections. And the Republicans said, no, you cheated in those elections. If Hayes gets to those Southern states, he wins the Electoral College. If he doesn't get them, he loses the Electoral College. And so in smoke-filled back rooms, the Republicans said, well, we'd rather have the presidency than fight over this lost cause in the South. And they agreed to the compromise of 1877. Hayes gets the White House, the Democrats get the South back. Reconstruction is over, and Black labor goes into sharecropping, and the Black codes constrict movement in the South. And then we'll remember that when the U.S. economy starts to heat up right at the turn of the century, the Supreme Court kind of put a nail in the coffin, declaring it constitutional to have separate worlds, Black and white worlds. This will be the law of the land until 1954, and Brown versus Board of Education overturned it. So 1890s, early 20th century, apartheid, anyone know what apartheid is, where it was? South Africa, and do you know what it was?
There was segregation there too.
Yeah. It was a system of racial hierarchies where Blacks were second-class citizens. They live outside of the city. They're labor. Whites live in the city, Johannesburg in particular. Overturned all these protests in the 80s. The architects of apartheid came to the American South at the turn of the century to figure out how to create a racial hierarchy, how to create a segregated racial hierarchy and a legal system that support it. So freed people are excluded from this economic boom, from these opportunities, and not there for them. I also mentioned Chinese laborers, also denied access to the labor opportunities in the second industrial revolution. Chester Arthur became president because of the assassination of Garfield. He signed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. No one from Asia, right? Now, is this a big deal? Is this not a big deal? Well, let's look at a chart of Chinese immigration. The black line is Chinese immigration. So this is your gold rush boom, and then it kind of levels off because the gold wasn't fully productive as it could have been. And then after 1865, what's driving that, do we think? Chinese immigration after 1865? Railroads. This is the Pacific Railroads Act coming into action, right? So Chinese in larger and larger numbers coming to build railroads. They're coming into California, moving east, right? And then a huge rush of immigration when the Chinese knew that the border was going to be shut down. And that's that last boom that's there. And then it's gone. No more. Right at the moment that acceleration and opportunities are getting started and growing. Asians will not be a part of this either, right? So who's going to fill the labor demands? Where's the United States going to find its labor? It's shut off access to this enormous 4 million person labor force in the South. It shut off access to the largest continent, country, most populated place on the planet for as long as human population has been on the planet. Neither of you guys have anything to do with this. We'll shut it down. So who's going to do it? So there's a chart that shows the volume and the major sources of immigration to the United States. And it identifies 4 major stages or phases based on the scale and the composition of the immigrant flow. And the slice in the middle between 1880 and 1920, this is our labor source for the second industrial revolution. And really the end of the first industrial revolution. From where? What does it say? Anywhere in particular in Europe? Southern and Eastern Europe. Southern and Eastern Europe. This is a different part of Europe, right? We're talking about Polish people, talking about Lithuanians, Italians, Serbians, right? And it's really that second one, because we want to remember this first, a large part of this first boom until 1882 was Chinese laborers, mostly for the railroad. And it also included a large number of skilled men with mining experience from Europe who were coming to fill the growing mining labor force. It was about the mass production, where that arrow is pointing. That's the mass production of mineral materials, getting men to the mines, to the smelting operations, and building the railroad that connects the national economy and gets all the supply chain of fabrication flowing. Then right after the turn of the century, just an explosion. That's the expansion that comes with mass production, right? The assembly line, opening up jobs for people with no skills. Southern and Eastern Europeans. What's different about Southern and Eastern Europeans from, say, Northern or Western Europeans? How are the British different from the Polish? Any ideas?
They were born.
They were as poor as any immigrants who came. I mean, a lot of people got by on about $1 a day at the turn of the century, including immigrants here. You think about their faith traditions. Any differences? Yeah, you look like you're thinking.
I'm thinking, so, like, I don't know, most of Europe basically have Christian beliefs, definitely Italians were more Catholic.
And what are the founding fathers and the founders of, how does America identify as a Catholic nation? And you're shaking your head. How does it identify? I mean, certainly a Christian nation. I think that's, but Catholic? No. What is the kind of primary identity?
Wasn't it like Protestant back in the day?
It's Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it's British Protestant, German Protestant, it's a Protestant tradition, and so not Catholic. And so like the question as this new wave of immigrant comes in is like, well, okay, they're Christians, but are they white? Or aren't they white, right? There's a real tension and question about that. Most of this new immigrant flow is Catholic. So Catholicism, which really didn't have a big presence, suddenly comes in waves into the United States. And Catholic parishes emerge. The one in Mansfield, just like all others around the United States, were around these large groups of ethnic Europeans. Ethnic whites was kind of how Americans thought about them at this point, asking who's really white. Most of them Catholic, a lot of them Jewish as well, so large flow of Jews. And the immigrants flooded into the United States in these years, right? When we think about that immigrant flow, when we think about the typical kind of immigrant story in the United States, this is what we're talking about, this period of time. And it was this remarkable flood, not of individuals, although it started, I'll explain with individuals, but ultimately entire families, right? Multi-generational, moving together, migrating for opportunity that they knew was there. And they participated in what is called chain migration. And so chain migration means you send your youngest son over there, he finds a job in the pork mill. He writes back and says, send the cousins and brothers, there's plenty of work here. Cousins and brothers come, and then behind them comes the moms, the grandmas, and the kids, and then the whole family's there. And then sometimes it's not just a family, sometimes entire villages, right? These were migrants who were themselves in the same situation in Europe as Blacks were in the South. They were in the debt peonage, they were peasants, they were living off the land. This was a place for them to come and find opportunity, right? So the whole families, whole villages. And like I said, when we think about the huddled masses teeming to the shores of the United States, we're thinking about the immigrants of the early 20th century who came in a tremendous wave, who filled our cities from New York to Chicago, Milwaukee to Pittsburgh, who came in this chain migration. And while they lived in sometimes appallingly squalid conditions, they still brought their families and their neighbors and their institutions and their traditions, and they settled in. They settled in for the long haul. They settled into their own specific parts of town, right? You might think about Germantown or Italian Village in Columbus, Little Italy in New York. Here, the immigrants began to replicate the customs and traditions of their home country. They came in such volumes they could bring it all with them. Like I said, young men would often migrate. This is the Italian Day Parade, so their own cultures and traditions. Young men would often migrate first to see what opportunities exist, but once the work was secured, four men liked this. If they found a guy who worked really well, they figured probably his relatives did too. This was their recruiting strategy, right? And so this worker would send back home for brothers and cousins every time work was needed. And often foremen, as I said, foremen would use this as a strategy to build their workforce around the best men that they could find. This chain migration and this movement of entire groups of people into the urban America had some really interesting impacts, both on the urban landscape, in that there are these little neo-Europes, little neos communities that grew up, but also in the workscapes, in the workplaces, areas of work would become dominated by one ethnic group or another, and then everyone could speak the same language and figure out what they need to do together and share in that. And so there are these little isolated ethnic enclaves around the workplace as well. And then together, they're all struggling to share these small spaces. They're getting by on little, and they're beginning to develop this identity of their own difficult position in the hierarchy of capitalism, right? They're at the bottom. We want to notice it was these immigrant communities that the settlement house workers were targeting. This is who they were looking to help along, right? This is where they did most of their work, helping the European immigrant at the dawn of the 20th century survive the first few years of the rough and tumble environment of urban America, of ethnic urban America. But the settlement house kind of sat along the edges, supporting in sort of the worst cases. Internally, these ethnic groups started to build a structure of life around them, right? These little Europes, little Catholic Europes in American cities, organized around social clubs, organized around social activities that were specific to their ethnicity and community. And it's worth noting the similarity between the social clubs, the communities themselves, and the work ended up facilitating the movement of something else, which was an idea about labor, what you might call a European radicalism, right? Unions, a very strong Marxist-Leninist tradition, this idea that collective bargaining and labor power was something that workers ought to exercise against the owners. And when these things happen, they often happen, strikes around ethnic groups who would walk out together. So unionization is permeating the workforce, and these trade unions begin to organize representing the interests of the several workers, of the workers in the several industries. So mining gets organized very early, meat packing in the early 20th century, transportation late 19th century. And a lot of the times, these are growing out of the same network of ethnicity and familial connections and social ties that came along. This made the federal government so nervous that by the time of World War I, and we'll get into a little more detail next time, they brought an end to it. These ethnic communities and the radicalism that seemed to come from them, and a general anti-Catholicism, like American Protestants didn't trust Catholics because they hadn't caught up with the game. They didn't understand the rules. They were playing by some archaic papal authoritarianism that made no sense to Protestants. This kind of, these little ethnic enclaves growing up in all of our cities, we need to make it stop because it's leading to radicalism. It's changing our society. And we see a backlash against immigration. You see immigration's literal collapse on the chart there, dropping off in 1917 and then again just plummeting in 1924. And these were two national laws. One of them was passed over Woodrow Wilson's veto, Immigration Act in 1917. And basically, you had to be able to speak English to get into this country. Literacy test, and it continued. Asian and Filipinos, no one from Asia. So Asians are not going to participate in this. And we don't want anyone else in here who's not speaking English, which causes it to plummet. But then the next was just to squeeze it out altogether. 7 years later, the border shut down. And immigration is set to a level 3% of any group's immigration level in 1890. Right? So it's literally like we are closing the gates all together. And so it dries up at flow. But we know that economic output continues to grow exponentially. The demand for labor didn't disappear because of this end of immigration. Just political comfort with Eastern and Southern Europeans. Now there was opposition to it. No more Catholics, really was the cry. Enough for the Catholics, the radical, they do crazy things. So where does industry turn for its growing labor demand as this is shutting down and the economy is still heating up? And now we go back to the South again. And suddenly, starting around 1910 and picking up speed by the middle 19 teens, industries in the North recognizing the slowing flow of labor from Europe, suddenly realized they had this enormous ocean of labor in the South, and they need only recruit. In the South, Americans, by Constitution citizens, English speakers, and they started to recruit, thus launching what's known as the Great Migration. So if you just look at this chart for a second, the orange toned circles are cities that increased their Black population. Blue circles lost Black population. And so the darker the color, the larger the change and the scale of the change itself. So you can see Chicago is kind of dead center there up in the lower part of Lake Michigan, but all through our area as well, right? And Springfield, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. Right? This wasn't a change of mind by sharecroppers. It wasn't like sharecroppers are starting like, hey, I'm sick and tired of growing cotton. I'm going to move north. It was a concerted effort by industries to recruit Blacks from the South. In part of their idea was, we'll get them up here working. They'll be so desperate for work, they'll break strikes. And so they first called them in as strike breakers. Come on in, when this ethnic group goes on strike, I'll just put these laborers to work. And you can imagine the kind of friction that might cause in a community when that happens. But in newspapers across the South, these kinds of advertisements appeared over and over and over again through the teens. Calls for labor, efforts to lure sharecroppers into wage work and factory work, to abandon the plantations and move on. And they responded as quickly as they possibly could. Just like the chain migration we saw from Europe, we see chain migration from the South. They'll send his son up, finds out there's work, he'll send back to the cousins, and then the mom and the grandparents come along, and suddenly the whole family, the whole plantation has moved to the south side of Chicago. This happened mostly in the teens between 1910 and 1920, although we can measure back to 1900 when there's the first trickling of it, all the way through 1929. These are the major paths and routes in which cities, it created a northern Black urban population that, other than New York City and a couple other places, did not exist before the 20th century. All these cities in the north. Sharecroppers who had labored in cotton fields, cotton growers, suddenly joined the path to opportunity opened by industrialization. And we can see here, right, in this photograph, it's a little blurry, but there's a biracial workforce. Suddenly, biracial workforces appear in the north. That's the bottom level. These are hard jobs, right? But these are former slaves or the children of slaves suddenly working for a wage. And so they took these jobs happily. Here's a biracial iron forge workers, and they took the jobs and they worked them hard, and they saved their money, and they bought property, and they tapped into this opportunity. They worked all the hard jobs. There's a biracial slaughterhouse workforce, right? Those men were not free when they were children, and now they're working for a wage in Chicago. It was, you might notice, a lot easier for the men than for the women. Mostly for Black women, the problem they had was there was a stigma that people had hiring a Black house servant. So nobody in the north would hire the women who knew how to do housework to do housework for them, because it had all the optics of a slavery that they didn't want anything to do with. But they did find work with the suffragettes. I'll talk about the women's opportunity that emerges. The suffragettes were very much about a biracial women's democracy. And this period of time, the teens, appeared to be a transformation for freedmen, for former slaves, for Blacks in America, from sharecropping in the South to finally access to this American opportunity machine, right? This was the older freedmen in the first generation of free Blacks. Finally, a generation and a half into freedom, being able to imagine an upward mobility. But upward mobility for African Americans is not going to be quite so easy to accomplish, as it turns out. So we remember large segments of rural America have been left behind by this industrialized economy. Farmers across the Midwest, across the Upper South, around the Great Plains, they're losing in this economy, and they're losing everything they've built, in some cases over generations, their homes, their livelihoods. And they're losing them as this mass culture is emerging where they can see that opportunity is flowing. It's flowing for this new wave of Catholic immigrants teeming into the city. It's flowing for these former slaves that are moving up into the cities of the North. And so we see in this period this self-identified whiteness, self-identified whites, also associated with Protestantism, not just in the countryside, but a rural perspective in pockets in the city as well. Felt like they were watching their country. They felt like they were watching, this might sound familiar, their country transform into something they didn't recognize. An urban mass culture that had little place for them. And it provided them few rewards for the hard work they had done. We've been left out. That's the sense. We've been left out. Worse, the opportunities are going to Catholics and Black people. And this was a problem. And so suddenly in the middle of the 19 teens, the Ku Klux Klan comes back. It reemerges. Actually reemerges in Illinois first. Southern Illinois was where it first got started. And it presents itself, it kind of rebrands itself just a little bit as a pro-family organization. And it gets support from such companies as Ford Motor Company, right? They're hosting social events, what they call them. But it also very quickly embraces the optics of mass culture. And so November 1915, just 10 months after Birth of a Nation, which you all should see came out. Birth of a Nation, which was the first time anyone had burned a cross. It was a fictionalized event. They borrowed the cross burning because they, by this point in time, were thinking about Birth of a Nation as a historically accurate document. And in Georgia, this is Stone Mountain, Georgia, the first real life cross burning by real, not actors, identified Ku Klux Klan who are copying the movie and all of the optics. They're borrowing from it, assuming it's a historical event. Copying the movie, but they're not getting all of their ideas from the movie. The movie is holding a set of ideas that are pretty culturally prevalent at that point. There's a lot of discontent. There's been a lot of changes in American society very, very quickly. But that discontent got shaped by mass culture into the modern Ku Klux Klan. And this time it wasn't a Southern movement alone. The Klan spread across the upper Midwest, out to the Great Plains, in cities around the United States. This is Albany Park, that's Chicago. You didn't know. And this new Klan, while the Klan of the 1860s and 70s focused exclusively on freedmen and stopping the vote, like they just didn't want political power. This modern Klan embraced a whole program of white supremacy. They were anti-Black, they were anti-Jewish, they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-immigration. They said race mixing is the worst thing that can possibly happen. And they believed in their hearts of hearts, and they believed science proved it to them. There was scientific racism at this point, saying there's a hierarchy of races, and white Anglo-Saxons are at the top. Unabashedly, unashamedly. This is the truth for them, right? And even after the passing of strict legislation in 1924, so 1925, and 1926, the Klan continued to march on Washington to protest the issue, even though there were no more immigrants. So if there's no more immigrants coming in, but you're still marching against immigrants in Washington, D.C., who's that targeted at? Borders are closed.
Think about migration.
Migration and the immigrants who are here now. Like at that point in time, so the immigrants who've come into the country before it got shut down, they're also being told, we don't want you either, right? And it's a national expression about that. They were organized to broadcast their national presence and their disdain for the people they didn't think were real Americans. And the marches were just an organized side of a growing terrorism and violence movement against Blacks in the North. We get the first inkling of how well Northerners were going to deal with Blacks in their midst in Abraham Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, Illinois. And this was the first of what would be more than 24 urban race riots. And when we say urban race riots in this period, what we mean is large mobs of whites assaulting Blacks, vandalizing their property, and destroying their homes. In Springfield, this happened because 2 Black men had been acquitted of raping a white woman. Let me say that again. 2 Black men had been acquitted of raping a white woman. But the whites would have none of it. And so they formed a mob and they went into the Black part of town and they started looting and burning and assaulting. Killed 9 Blacks, $150,000 in property damage. This went on through the 19-teens. We can look in Texas, Slocum, Texas, where a Black man was acquitted, again, by the justice system. Whites don't like it. So they turn on the Black part of town to kill at least 22, probably more. East St. Louis, 1917, right? There's somewhere between 50 and 100 Blacks killed. East St. Louis, Ferguson, same place, right? Race riots in 1917, Philly in 1918, right? These are the places where Blacks are first getting a taste of opportunity, first investing those dollars they're able to earn through wages for the very first time in their property, and their lives are being destroyed. This goes on through 1919. 1919 was called the Red Summer because of all the violence. The most reported on was the Chicago race riot of 1919. This was about 2 Black boys swimming in the white part of the beach. And somebody didn't like it, and they threw a rock, and it hit one of the Black boys and drowned him. But the story that came out was that the boys had drowned some white person, and the whites went nuts and terrorized the Black part of town. It went on for almost 4 days. 2,000 homes lost, all based on a rumor that was false. 8 days, not 4 days. 10 Blacks killed, thousands arrested. Blacks get arrested. So one of the things that starts to happen after 1919 as these events take place is that Blacks are coming back from service in World War I. They have a greater sense of their place as Americans because of that service, and they start to fight back. But fighting back just brings more violence to their heads. It leads to more arrests. And what happens if you're a Black person who gets arrested? You're going back to slavery, because the 13th Amendment doesn't outlaw slavery if you've been arrested, right? So this becomes a path in that way. The Red Summer of 1919, riots all over the country, white people attacking Black people and destroying everything that they built. 12 cities. Here's just some of them, and it was always the same story. Some rumor, some Black men being acquitted, justice working justice, and whites not wanting it that way. And what we begin to see by the early 1920s is that ethnic workers are also willingly participating in these riots, right? They begin to get white credibility by participating in anti-Black violence in the early 1920s. Tulsa race riots. So the song you heard, "Drop the Bomb on Me," that's from a band, the Gap Band from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they're actually gesturing to the literal bombing that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you've ever seen The Watchmen, the opening scene of The Watchmen depicts the violence itself. They brought airplanes in, they bombed them. This was the wealthiest Black community outside of Harlem in the United States. It was known as Black Wall Street. And there'd been a court case where a Black man was acquitted, and the whites would have none of it. A girl, actually, a white girl, said she'd been raped by a Black man. It was all a fraud, but when he didn't get put in jail for that, their entire community and all of their wealth just got ripped out from under them. So opportunities opened up for former slaves, and they benefited from them. And as soon as they did, those benefits were taken back. And in many cases, as I suggested, it was working class whites who ended up being the most aggressive, right? It's kind of similar to the way in which the poorest whites were kind of the most racist after the Civil War, because they were right on the same level and they wanted to get one up on them. They wanted to get some credibility. In this case, ethnic whites, Italians, Poles, they wanted to be seen as white. They didn't want to be seen as Catholic immigrants. But this kind of divisiveness weakened any efforts at unionization of any kind of biracial workforce, because it pits these workers against each other. But it did, this process we can see, start to make ethnic whites into real whites, real white Americans. And then we just want to notice, for African Americans, we've now seen two punctuations of opportunity and opportunity taken away. The Reconstruction, the 1860s and 1870s, by racial democracy, the opportunity to be full citizens and participants shut down, pushed onto sharecroppers. And then they sit on sharecrops while immigrants take all of these jobs. And then in the early 20th century, when those jobs open up again, they get kicked back down to the bottom as soon as they benefit from them. And this is so 1921. You all heard the Confederate statue debate. It was last year, the year before. Should we take them down? Should we not take them down? Think about it. You make your own decision about it. Those statues went up in these years. Those statues didn't go up in 1860 or 1870. They went up in the 19-teens and the 1920s by forces who wanted to say, we lost something we need back, right? They were a statement of terror against Black advancement in the 19-teens and 1920s. We got two other groups we got to cover here. I want to talk about Native Americans quickly. So this is where we left Native Americans in 1890s. Native people, they're on reservations, they're non-citizens, they're wards of the state. They are dependent on the US government to deliver them their welfare, to provide them food and subsidies, etc. And we remember it was a very violent final push, the Wounded Knee Massacre. Lakota Sioux finally gets as the last group to move onto reservations in this period of time, which, and the reason I put these two maps together to just sort of gather the scope of the loss. We reduced the tribal territory from the entire continent at contact. It was full from one end to the other, to a few tiny places, mostly in the far west by 1890. Right, so a good 250 years of work there, cleaning that up. By the 1890s, the Indian Bureau felt that those lands would probably be better as private property for Native people. And so they began putting the reservation up for sale and selling it to Native people and non-Native people. And around some of these reservations, there was a tangle now of tribal ownership and private ownership because of this policy in the 1890s and the early 20th century. So some Native people were gradually able to become property owners by about 1910, but they remained non-citizens, right? And that's a really tricky place to be if you're not a citizen. You're not protected by the Constitution. The laws don't apply to you in the same way, right? You're a foreigner in a foreign land, even though you live here. And so they have no individual rights. They have no standing in the courts. It's a very complicated outsider place to be. And what happens in these spaces? Dire poverty, absolute dire poverty. These are people who were nomadic 150 years before, now stuck on the most waste places in the American West, the least desirable landscapes. They got their first whiff of change with World War I. And this was really the most significant change since Wounded Knee. The US government said, hey, if you're willing to send your men to fight for us, we'll give you citizenship. And so because of World War I service, the first 12,000 Native Americans who served, the 12,000 Native Americans who served became the first Indian, Native American citizenship in US history, gained their citizenship that way. And so suddenly at least these 1,200 can use the courts and can begin to make claims on the federal government and begin to ask additional questions about what their rights might be in this space. So let's think a minute about the story of Blacks and Native Americans in this story of America. I think it's kind of obvious when we look at it that opportunity wasn't offered to everybody in the same way. The opportunity was real, but it wasn't offered to everybody in the same way. And what you see from that, and we'll continue to think about this into the 20th century, is that when you exclude people, when you treat people as non-people, non-citizens, right, not a part of it, those aren't just momentary acts, but those are acts that have historical consequences and that set patterns that last for a longer time. Put it another way, we know from looking at both Blacks and Native Americans that this kind of racism, and that's what it is, these are different races, they don't belong, has material consequences over time. Because if you can't access opportunity, you have no chance of bettering yourself, and you have no chance of creating a better world for your children. It's really the children where we see this happen through most of the migration. It was the second generation that did better. If you can't even get your own feet under you, how do you offer that wealth forward? And even worse, so Native Americans just marginalized. For African Americans, twice offered hope, twice offered opportunity, and then had it violently burned right out from under you, right? While the federal government, who has the laws to stop it from happening, just stands by and lets it happen, right? Native people are only granted citizenship if they're willing to put their bodies on the line. That's it. We see as well, and I think we want to think about the ethnic whites. They're trapped in this situation as well, right? They're being exploited, they're insecure, they're trying to find their place in America. They have horrible working conditions and living conditions. But for the ethnic whites, access meant their children and grandchildren could advance, right? Maybe even your own grandparents were in this situation. So let me just ask you to think about this. Is this because of capitalism that happens? Do we have Native people in reservations and Black people in sharecrops and then having their wealth burned out from under them because of capitalism, because of this system itself? Why not?
And I would say, since like we got like capitalism through like this whole structure, but like as far as like the earnings and like wages are different from the social movements of like the racism and like the KKK.
Right.
They're like two separate things. So I don't think it would involve both
Okay.
in the same sense.
So capitalism isn't causing it, but facilitates it? Would that be?
You know,
if you think about it, if you genuinely think about it, the executives, the middle managers, and the divisional people above the laborers
Yeah.
are mostly white.
They are.
Yeah.
And mostly male.
There's not a lot of people in power in these positions that are people of color, and they just think, oh, since I'm looking above this person, I'll be better than them.
So the structure, the hierarchy then creates, it reinforces itself.
Yeah.
And that's the tricky thing about the hierarchy. But I would suggest to you, and I think the present and the changes in the 20th century and early 21st century prove this, capitalism doesn't need racism. It doesn't need racial divisions. It doesn't need to divide people this way at all. It doesn't, the system itself does not require it. But because it's a hierarchy, it will tend to reinforce hierarchies that already exist. But what keeps Native people on reservations and what kept freed people in sharecropping was racism. That was a cultural impulse. That was white supremacy saying this is the right structure of the hierarchy itself. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear and people will talk about, well, capitalism has to have this racism built into it. I don't buy that. Capitalism created more opportunity for everybody in the 20th. Everybody, even the people who didn't get the best opportunity still had opportunity in the 20th century because of this wealth growing system, right? And it carried inside of it this sort of ugly social hierarchy that continued to stay with it, but it wasn't necessary. And so we want to understand what went wrong there. If we want to understand what went wrong there, we need to look not at throwing capitalism out for some form of socialism, but throwing racism out for some form of, look, everybody should have a fair chance. It's that simple. We're all human. We're all human at the start of the day, right? At this point in time, as I suggested, though, racism wasn't just this tricky thing that we deal with today. It was something people believed is true. It was truth for white America that whites were the best. And it wasn't something that anybody was ashamed about talking about. It wasn't anything anybody was ashamed about putting in the law. It was reality because of things like scientific racism, this fundamental belief that whites are superior. All right, let's think about the social structure one more time as we finish up, because there's one more group we got to kind of wrestle out of this mix. So growing middle class, growing wealth. What do you know? Who's in the picture on the right? That's my middle class family. Who's in that? What do you see? Yeah, so dad, mom, boy, girl, looks like a girl, right? So two women, right? Here's the thing about the complicated thing about gender and women. They were part of family units whose wealth expanded. They were daughters in families where the wealth expanded. And so opportunities for women came earlier than the political vote itself. And we saw Jane Addams merges out of the elite class into the settlement house movement, creates all these opportunities for elite professional women. But that increase in that middle class, it goes twice as far. These are not single men who are managers. These are fathers, which means they have a spouse and 50-50, they got a daughter, if not more than one daughter, right? So this wealth is moving out through the family unit, and that's where those opportunities are coming into being. But women did not have full citizenship. Women did not have full citizenship, and they'd been fighting for it since the early 19th century. Women did not have the vote. They were not recognized as political subjects. And we remember they started early. They aligned themselves with the abolitionists, right? In the 1850s, women saw that this is a joint cause. This is about extending justice. We'll get the vote. They'll get the vote. And then the rubber hit the road. And Frederick Douglass says, if we put women in this constitutional amendment, we will never get it passed. Americans are not going to accept extending the vote, and then we'll risk never getting it to Black men. And that's the most important thing of the moment. Do not put it at risk. And she agreed. And so they suspended their argument in the 1870s for women's suffrage. And it would kind of fall away. You know, we'd see the movement through elite women, the settlement house movement, and then this kind of growing wealth that women were acquiring both because of their participation in the economy and because of their families' participation in the economy. And the growth of women's wealth created a renewed interest in women's political participation, right? And there's a kind of early 20th century feminism that emerges and becomes national by the 19-teens. This is the 1913 March on Washington, right? Women are going to Washington saying, give us the vote. These are younger women, a new organization of activists. They're calling on, and we'll see this next time, the progressive national government, they said has an obligation to fulfill the promise of democracy to American women. We deserve the vote, right? They marched in DC, they marched in New York, and they put together a strategy when the war broke up in Europe to force Woodrow Wilson, to shame Woodrow Wilson, essentially. And this is the woman architect of that strategy, Alice Paul, fiery feminist and activist. She was not going to take no for an answer. And so she developed a civil disobedience strategy. She said, you know what? We're going to Woodrow Wilson's front door. And they started picketing the White House. Middle of the war. You're fighting a war for democracy and you don't extend the vote to the women in the United States. Alice Paul went further than picketing the White House. She chained herself to the gates of the White House to hold them closed, an act for which she was arrested, placed in jail. Once she was in jail, and this was all mass media, this was on the radio, this was a big deal. She went on a hunger strike. And so they held her down, stuck a tube down her throat and force-fed her so she wouldn't die in jail. But all of this publicity in the middle of the war, which we'll see a little bit next time, was kind of sketchy in terms of what was happening to American society. Wilson was like, I can't have this kind of chaos. And he conceded and allowed the process for the 19th Amendment to begin, right? And it finally became constitutional law on August 18th. 1920, there's the date, front page. Full bold headline, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Henceforth, women will have the vote in the United States of America. It took a little while longer to get women up into the highest power. We now have a female vice president for the first time in history. But women find themselves moving into first political positions by the 20s, and then through the Roosevelt administration, we'll see them moving into federal government power as well. Next time, we're going to look at the politics around this, okay? And we're going to look at the political developments. We're going to look at the rise of the progressives through Teddy Roosevelt and the sort of disaster he spawned, Woodrow Wilson's kind of democratic racism, progressivism, and then the end of the fifth party system and the Republicans who they hold rule essentially through this, and this would be the end of the Republicans by the end of the 1929. We'll see next time. The Republicans and their connection to this industrial growth is just kind of totally sour, and Americans ask for a brand new day. But we'll get to that next time. That's all I have for today. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Were there any questions? Let me just throw this out. Any questions on the movie? That is due on Friday, and questions on the exam. Happy to take any of those. You're welcome to go if you got them. There we go. No notes on the exam. Yes, sir. If you're using Word, then you put the